Coffee shops in this city don't run on caffeine. They run on desperate anonymity. You sit, you stare at a glowing screen, you ignore the wailing sirens outside, and you pretend you are entirely alone. But what happens when the violence you try so hard to block out pulls up a chair at your very table? She just wanted a cheap, burnt Americano. She didn't know the stranger bleeding onto the vinyl booth owned the streets she feared. Sometimes kindness is a death sentence. Water dripped from the ceiling in a steady, maddening rhythm, hitting a plastic bucket near the pastry case with a hollow thwack. Nora stared at her laptop screen until the spreadsheet cells blurred into a solid wall of grey. Her coffee was cold. It tasted like ash and 2 long, steeped regrets, but she took another sip anyway. The grind and pour wasn't a nice place. It was a narrow, aggressively overheated corridor of a cafe, where the espresso machine constantly hissed like a dying lung, and the windows were eternally fogged with cheap heating and damp bodies. Today, a Tuesday in November, a torrential downpour had shoved half the neighborhood inside. Every chipped Formica table was claimed. People stood shoulder to shoulder near the door, radiating wet dog smells of damp wool and cheap polyester umbrellas. Nora had a 2-seater booth in the far back corner near the restrooms. It smelled faintly of industrial bleach and stale cinnamon, but it was hers. She had her cheap wired headphones pushed deep into her ears, though no music was playing. It was a defense mechanism. A bright neon sign above her head flickered, casting a sickly pink wash over her pale, exhausted face. She was 26, running on 4 hours of sleep, and trying to figure out how to stretch $40 across 6 days of groceries. She didn't look up when the heavy glass door shoved open, scraping violently against the warped linoleum floor, but she felt the shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. A rush of freezing ozone-heavy air cut through the stagnant warmth. The low hum of overlapping conversations faltered just for a second. Nora finally lifted her gaze. A man was standing near the entrance. He didn't look like the finance bros who occasionally got lost looking for the artisanal roaster 3 streets over, nor did he look like the usual transient crowd trying to buy an hour of warmth with a $2 tea. He just looked ruined. He wore a dark, heavy coat that was completely saturated water sluicing off the shoulders and pooling around his heavy boots. His hair, a dark, indeterminate shade, was plastered to his forehead. He wasn't looking at the menu. He was scanning the room. His eyes a startling washed-out grey that looked like fractured ice under the fluorescent lights raked over the crowd with mechanical precision. Nora felt a sudden irrational spike of adrenaline in the hollow of her throat. He started walking. He didn't weave through the cramped spaces, apologizing like a normal person. He moved in a straight line, and the people standing in the aisles instinctively stepped backward, bumping into tables to clear his path. He didn't thank them. He didn't even look at them. He was heading straight for the back. Straight for her. Nora gripped her ceramic mug. The porcelain was cold and slick. Don't look at him, she told herself. Look at the screen. She focused on column D, row 14. A heavy, wet thump sounded as a large hand clamped onto the back of the empty wooden chair opposite her. Taken. His voice was a low rasp, like gravel grinding under a heavy tire. It wasn't a polite inquiry. It was a statement of intent. Nora blinked, looking up. Up close, the damage was obvious. There was a jagged, angry split along his left eyebrow, the skin swollen and leaking a slow, sluggish trail of red down his temple. The knuckles on the hand gripping the chair were split open, the flesh around them bruised a sickly yellow-purple. He smelled like rain ozone wet leather and something sharp and metallic. Blood. Fresh, warm blood. Every survival instinct Nora possessed screamed at her to say she was waiting for a friend, to grab her laptop and practically run to the exit. He was dangerous. It rolled off him in waves, thick and suffocating, but her throat felt dry. And beneath the terrifying, aggressive aura, she saw a microscopic tremor in the fingers clutching the wood. He was exhausted. bone-deep, dangerously exhausted. She hated herself for it. She hated that she couldn't just be ruthless. No, she said, her voice cracking slightly. She cleared her throat. Go ahead. He didn't smile. He just pulled the chair out. It scraped loudly against the floor. He sat down heavily, the wet coat creaking. He didn't take it off. He didn't go to the counter to order. He just sat, placing his forearms on the sticky table, ignoring the fact that he was bleeding onto the laminated wood. Nora pulled her laptop a few inches closer to her chest, a useless, pathetic barricade. "You're bleeding!" she blurted out. The words bypassed her brain completely. He slowly turned his head. Those dead grey eyes locked onto hers. The silence between them stretched thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the hiss of the espresso machine and the muffled chatter of the cafe. "I'm aware," he said flatly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled, faintly soiled paper napkin, pressing it against his temple. He didn't flinch as the rough paper dragged against the open wound. Nora looked back at her screen. She couldn't type. Her fingers felt numb. A total stranger, battered and smelling of copper, was sitting 18 inches from her. She could hear his breathing shallow, tightly controlled hiding pain. She was sharing her tiny, insignificant island of safety with a storm, and she had no idea how to navigate it. 20 minutes passed. It felt like 4 hours. Nora pretended to work. She hit the spacebar occasionally. She highlighted a cell, unhighlighted it. Her peripheral vision was entirely hijacked by the man across from her. He hadn't moved much. A waitress, a teenager named Chloe, who usually looked bored out of her mind, had cautiously approached the table 5 minutes in, taking one look at the man's bloody face and taking a physical step back. He had ordered black coffee. He paid with a crumpled 20 and told her to keep the change. Now the mug sat between his large, scarred hands. He wasn't drinking it. Nora covertly studied him while pretending to read an email. He wasn't conventionally handsome. His features were too sharp, too brutal. A strong, angular jaw covered in dark stubble, a slightly crooked nose that looked like it had been broken and reset badly, and those eyes. They were constantly tracking. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the reflection in the dark, rain-streaked window beside them. From this angle, the glass acted as a perfect, slightly distorted mirror of the cafe's front entrance. He was waiting for something, or someone. The realization made Nora's stomach drop. The metallic smell of his blood was now overpowered by the bitter aroma of his burnt coffee, but the danger hadn't dissipated. It had coiled up. He sat with the stillness of a coiled spring. "You should leave," he said suddenly. Nora jumped her elbow, clipping her own mug. It rattled wildly on the saucer. She caught it just before it tipped. What?" she breathed. He didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the window reflection. "Pack up your computer. Go out the back door by the restrooms. Now." The sheer calm authority in his voice sparked a flare of defensive anger in Nora's chest, cutting through the fear. She was tired, she was broke, and she was sick of being pushed around. "Excuse me," she snapped, surprising herself. "I was here first. If anyone's leaving, it's you. You're bleeding on my table." He finally turned his gaze away from the glass to look at her. For a split second, something resembling amusement flickered deep in his eyes, but it was gone, instantly replaced by a cold, hard impatience. "I'm not asking for your seat," he said softly. The low volume of his voice somehow cut through the cafe noise better than a shout. "I'm telling you that in about 30 seconds, this place is going to become a very bad environment for a civilian." Nora froze. "Civilian? What kind of person uses that word?" Before she could process it, the front bell chimed. The man across from her didn't reach for a weapon, but his entire body locked into stone. The casual slouch vanished. Nora turned her head, instinctively looking towards the door. 3 men had walked in. They were dressed too well for the neighborhood. Dark, tailored overcoats, leather gloves, despite being indoors. They weren't shaking off umbrellas. They stood just inside the entrance, their eyes scanning the crowded room. They looked like predators sorting through a herd of sheep. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Nora's chest. Her throat tightened. She looked back at the man at her table. He was staring directly at the three men. He slowly slid his right hand under his heavy wet coat. Nora's breathing turned shallow. This wasn't a movie. This was a Tuesday. She couldn't afford a trip to the hospital. She didn't have insurance. She couldn't die here smelling of cheap cinnamon and dirty mop water. Her hand started to shake. She reached for her laptop, intending to slam it shut and run just as he had told her. But her trembling fingers knocked awkwardly against her half-empty coffee mug. This time she didn't catch it. The heavy ceramic tipped over with a loud, distinct clatter, sending a wave of cold, sludgy brown liquid across the table over the edge and directly onto her lap. "Shit!" Nora gasped, jumping up so fast her chair screeched agonizingly against the linoleum. The cold coffee soaked instantly through her thin jeans, freezing against her thighs. The loud noise acted like a gunshot in the tense cafe. Half the room turned to look at her, including the three men at the door. Nora stood there, dripping her face, burning with a fiery, humiliating red. She frantically grabbed at the flimsy napkin dispenser, pulling out fistfuls of cheap paper that tore into useless shreds in her panicked hands. She started dabbing frantically at her jeans, a pathetic, clumsy display. She glanced up, terrified she had just drawn the killers right to them. The three men were staring at her. They looked at her frantic, messy flailing, then their gaze slid over the man sitting across from her. Because Nora was standing blocking the harsh neon light from above, the man at the table was cast entirely in shadow. He was slouched down again, a heavy wet coat wrapped around him, just another miserable vagrant trying to stay warm. The lead man by the door sneered in disgust at the mess Nora was making, muttered something to his companions, and they turned away. They didn't see the apex predator in the shadows. They saw a clumsy, spilled coffee disaster of a girl and moved on. The door chimed as they walked back out into the rain. Nora stopped wiping her jeans. Her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her teeth. Slowly she looked down. The man pulled his hand out from his coat. It was empty. He sat up slightly, the neon light catching the bruised, battered planes of his face once more. He looked at the door, then back at Nora. He didn't say thank you. He didn't acknowledge that her clumsy, embarrassing panic had just provided the perfect camouflage. He reached across the table, picked up a single dry napkin that had survived the flood, and held it out to her. Nora stared at his hand. His knuckles were raw meat, the scars on his fingers thick and silvery. She slowly reached out and took the napkin. Their fingers brushed. His skin was rough like sandpaper, and despite the freezing rain burning hot. "Go home," he said. It wasn't a threat this time. It was almost a command born of something resembling mercy. He stood up. He was taller than she realized. Much taller. He dropped a $100 bill onto the puddle of cold coffee on the table. The paper immediately began to soak up the brown liquid. He turned and walked toward the back exit by the restrooms, pushing through the heavy fire door and vanishing into the alleyway. Nora stood trembling in the middle of the cafe, cold coffee soaking into her skin, holding a single dry napkin like a lifeline. Nora's apartment was a fourth-floor walk-up that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and cat urine, despite the fact that she didn't own a cat. She shoved her key into the deadbolt. It stuck as it always did. She had to jiggle it left, pull it slightly toward her, and shove it hard to the right. The lock gave way with a pathetic click. She stepped inside, locking it immediately behind her and throwing the heavy deadbolt. She leaned back against the cheap veneer of the door and let out a long, shaky exhale. The adrenaline from the cafe was finally crashing, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion that settled deep into her bones. She peeled off her cold, coffee-stained jeans, leaving them in a wet pile on the worn floorboards, and pulled on a pair of oversized, threadbare sweatpants. The heat in the apartment wasn't working again. She could see the faint puff of her own breath in the dim light of the single street lamp, filtering through the blinds. She sat down on the edge of her mattress. She couldn't afford a bed frame yet, and opened her bag to pull out her laptop. Her hand brushed against something cold and heavy at the bottom of the canvas tote. Nora frowned. She dug around the charging cables and loose pens, her fingers closing around a solid metallic object. She pulled it out. It was a lighter, but not a cheap plastic one from a gas station. This was heavy, solid, brushed steel, cold, and substantial in her palm. It looked vintage, but perfectly maintained. The metal was smooth, devoid of any tacky engravings, just a sleek, dangerous piece of hardware. She stared at it. She didn't smoke. She had never seen this lighter before in her life. Then she remembered the panic, her frantic grabbing at napkins on the table. Her bag had been open on the seat next to her, shoved hastily against the wall. When he had reached out, when she had spilled the coffee, he must have slipped it in. Why, accident unlikely. A man who sat with the calculated stillness of a sniper didn't accidentally drop a half-pound steel lighter into a stranger's bag. She flicked the lid open. It made a sharp, satisfying clink. The smell of premium butane hit her nose, sharp and sweet. She struck the flint. A perfectly controlled, hissing blue flame roared to life, casting dancing shadows on the peeling wallpaper of her bedroom. She snapped it shut. The silence of the apartment rushed back in heavier than before. The next day the rain had stopped, leaving the city looking bruised and washed clean. Nora shouldn't have gone back to grind and pour. She knew she shouldn't. But her cheap coffee machine was broken, her head was pounding with a caffeine withdrawal migraine, and a perverse, gnawing curiosity was eating at the edges of her common sense. She told herself he wouldn't be there. Lightning didn't strike the same shitty cafe twice. She walked in at exactly 11 a.m. The atmosphere in the cafe was wrong. It wasn't crowded. In fact, it was dead silent. The hissing espresso machine was quiet. The low hum of indie folk music that usually played from the corner speakers was turned off. Chloe, the teenager behind the counter, was standing rigid, staring straight ahead with wide, terrified eyes. She wasn't wiping down the counter. She wasn't looking at her phone. She looked like a hostage. Nora swallowed hard. She looked toward the back corner. He was there. He was sitting at the exact same two-seater booth near the restrooms. He wasn't wearing the wet heavy coat today. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit jacket over a black Henley. The bruises on his face were starting to purple and yellow, but he looked entirely different. Clean. Lethal. In command. He was drinking from a small porcelain espresso cup. There were two men standing near the restrooms, one by the fire exit, one near the hallway. They wore dark suits. They were looking at Nora. Nora's feet stopped moving. Her brain screamed at her to turn around and walk back out into the bright, cold daylight. But her body was frozen. The man at the table set his small cup down. The ceramic clicked sharply against the saucer. He looked across the empty room, his grey eyes pinning her to the spot. He raised a hand, two fingers extending just a fraction of an inch, pointing at the empty chair across from him. It wasn't a request. Nora's legs moved on autopilot. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She walked past the empty tables. The silence was deafening. Every step felt like walking underwater. She reached the table and stopped. She didn't sit. She stood there clutching her bag to her chest like a shield. "I sit," he said. His voice was smoother today, less gravelly, but it still held that underlying, terrifying weight. Nora slowly lowered herself into the wooden chair. It didn't screech this time. She sat on the very edge, her knees pressed tightly together. "You left this," Nora blurted out. Her voice was too loud, too squeaky. She unzipped her bag, her hands shaking so badly she fumbled the zipper twice, pulled out the heavy steel lighter and pushed it across the laminated table. He didn't look at the lighter. He looked at her. "I didn't leave it," he said calmly. "I gave it to you." Nora's brow furrowed in confusion, temporarily overriding her fear. "Why, because if those men had walked back in, he said, leaning back slightly, his eyes cold and analytical. Or if they had caught you in the alley, showing them that lighter would have kept you breathing long enough for my people to find you. The breath punched out of Nora's lungs. She stared at the steel lighter resting between them on the table. It suddenly looked like a live grenade. "Who are you?" she whispered. The words tasted like ash. He rested his arms on the table. The sleeves of his suit jacket pulled back slightly, revealing a thick band of dark ink wrapping around his wrist, a heavily stylized tattoo of a crown intertwined with thorns. Nora wasn't an idiot. She lived in this city. Everyone knew what that mark meant. It belonged to the syndicate that ran the docks, the underground casinos, and half the local politicians, the people who made other people vanish into the river. "My name is Gideon," he said. The way he said it, he didn't need a last name. The implication was heavy enough to crush her windpipe. Nora felt a cold, sickening drop in her stomach. The realization wasn't a dramatic gasp. It was a creeping, paralyzing dread. She had told a Mafia boss he was bleeding on her table. She had yelled at him. "Why did you let me sit down yesterday?" Gideon asked. The question was blunt, stripping away all the tension in the room and replacing it with raw curiosity. Nora swallowed. She couldn't find a lie. Her brain was completely short-circuiting. "I don't know. You looked tired. And I didn't want to be a bitch." For the first time, a genuine, albeit microscopic, shift occurred in Gideon's expression. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. It barely qualified as a smile, but it entirely transformed his brutal features. "You didn't want to be a bitch?" He repeated the words, rolling around in his mouth like he was tasting a foreign delicacy. "Yes," Nora said defensively, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch, despite the fact that her knees were trembling under the table. Gideon picked up the lighter. He flipped the lid open with his thumb. Clink. "You saved my life yesterday, Nora," he said softly. Nora blinked. How did he know her name? She hadn't given it to him. She hadn't used a credit card today. The realization that he had already looked into her, already found out who she was, sent a shiver down her spine. "I spilled coffee," she said weakly. "You created a diversion," Gideon corrected. He snapped the lighter shut and slid it back across the table toward her. "Keep it." "I don't want it." "It wasn't a request," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the faint amusement. "You did me a favor. In my world, favors are debts, and I don't like being in debt to civilians." He stood up. The two men by the restrooms instantly straightened. "I bought this cafe this morning," Gideon said, casually buttoning his suit jacket. "The coffee is terrible, but the location is useful. You can keep your table. No one will bother you here again." He looked down at her one last time, those fractured ice eyes pinning her to her seat. "Don't lose the lighter, Nora." He turned and walked towards the front door. The two men followed silently in his wake. The heavy glass door swung open, and they stepped out into the crisp autumn air. Nora sat alone in the dead, silent cafe, staring at the cold steel lighter resting on the sticky formica table. She had thought she was invisible. She had thought she was safe in her pathetic, mundane little life. She reached out and closed her fingers around the metal. It was still warm from his hand. Routine is a poor substitute for safety, but it was the only thing Nora could afford. Thursday arrived with a bitter, biting wind that rattled the loose window panes of Nora's apartment. She sat cross-legged on her mattress, a frayed blanket draped over her shoulders, staring at the harsh glare of her laptop. She was doing freelance translation work, a soul-crushing gig, converting poorly written corporate training manuals from dense, jargon-heavy English into something resembling digestible prose. At 3 cents a word, it barely covered her electric bill. She was hyper-aware of language. She spent her days dissecting syntax, agonizing over the precise meaning of verbs, and analyzing how a subtle shift in vocabulary could alter an entire power dynamic. It was an occupational hazard. That was why Gideon terrified her. It wasn't just the blood or the men in suits, it was his complete lack of linguistic waste. When men were nervous, they talked. They filled silence with stutters, bravado, and contractions. Gideon didn't. He spoke in absolute, unyielding statements. His silence wasn't an absence of words, it was a physical weight he pressed against the room. By noon, the cold in her apartment became unbearable. Her fingers were too stiff to type. She packed her bag. She didn't look at the heavy steel lighter sitting on her cracked dresser. She left it there. The walk to the grind and pour took 12 minutes. The neighborhood hadn't changed, trash still collected in the gutters, and the pawn shop on the corner still had its neon sign buzzing like an angry hornet. But the cafe was completely unrecognizable. Not visually. The chipped Formica tables were still there. The awful pink neon sign still hummed. But the atmosphere was sterile, clinical. Nora pushed the heavy glass door open. The chime sounded too loud. The usual eclectic mix of college students, transients, and exhausted remote workers was gone. The cafe was entirely empty, save for two massive men in dark sweaters sitting by the front window, nursing lukewarm teas. They didn't look at her, but she felt their awareness scan her like a barcode. Chloe was gone. In her place behind the counter stood a man in his late 30s with perfect posture, an immaculate white shirt, and a sharply tailored apron. He looked less like a barista and more like a high-end mortician. Americano. Nora said, her voice sounding thin in the quiet room. Black. Of course, miss. The man said. His accent was faintly European, his tone polished to a mirrored shine. On the house. I can pay. She snapped, digging into her pocket for her crumpled bills. Mr. Gideon's strict instructions. The barista replied, sliding a ceramic mug across the counter. It wasn't the chipped, stained mugs they usually used. It was brand new, perfectly white, and scalding hot. Your table is waiting. Nora's jaw tightened. She hated this. She hated the presumption, the invisible strings wrapping around her wrists. But the coffee smelled like actual high-quality espresso, and her head was pounding with caffeine withdrawal. She took the mug and walked to her corner booth. She opened her laptop. She tried to focus on a paragraph about warehouse compliance regulations. 20 minutes later, the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted. Nora didn't look up. She felt the cold draft from the front door, heard the heavy, measured footfalls against the warped linoleum. The chair opposite her scraped out. Gideon sat down. He wore a dark charcoal overcoat today, tailored so sharply it looked like armor. The bruises on his face were fading into a sickly yellow, the cut on his eyebrow held together by sterile strips. He brought the scent of cold air, expensive leather, and a faint hint of tobacco with him. He didn't order anything. He just sat, placing his large hands on the table. He was looking at her screen. Nora highlighted a sentence, hit delete, and started typing aggressively. The employee must ensure, "You didn't bring it," Gideon said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated against the bottom of Nora's coffee cup. She didn't stop typing. "Bring what?" "The lighter. I don't smoke. That isn't what it's for, and you know it." Nora finally stopped. She looked up, meeting those fractured ice eyes. Up close, she could see the faint, dark circles beneath them. He was a man who carried a brutal amount of stress, yet held it perfectly contained. "I don't want your protection, Gideon," she said, keeping her voice low. "I don't want anything to do with whatever it is you do. I spilled a cup of coffee. That's it. We are not friends. We are not associates." Gideon stared at her. He didn't look angry. He looked vaguely fascinated, like a scientist watching a moth repeatedly throw itself against a light bulb. "You think you have a choice?" He murmured. It wasn't a question. "I do have a choice. I'm choosing to sit here, do my work, and go back to my apartment, alone." "The men who walked in here 2 days ago," Gideon said, leaning forward slightly. The proximity made Nora's chest tighten. "They belong to a rival family, a family that currently wants my head on a pike. They saw you. They saw you make a scene that allowed me to slip out the back. In their eyes, Nora, you are no longer a civilian. You are an asset, or a liability. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her stomach. I didn't do anything. Intention doesn't matter in my world, he replied smoothly. Perception is reality. They perceive you as mine. I am not yours. The words tore out of her raw and furious. Gideon's gaze dropped to her mouth for a fraction of a second before meeting her eyes again. The shift was microscopic, but it sent a violent shockwave of adrenaline through her bloodstream. That is a matter of semantics, he said quietly. He stood up. Keep the lighter in your pocket, Nora. Pride won't stop a bullet. He turned and walked out, leaving the scent of leather and danger lingering heavily in the air. Friday night, the heat in Nora's building finally died completely. She was wrapped in 2 blankets, aggressively typing out a translation regarding structural load-bearing metrics, when heavy, obnoxious pounding rattled her front door. She froze. The digital clock on her stove read 11:42 p.m. Nora opened up. It was Miller, her landlord, a sleazy, perpetually sweating man who smelled of stale beer and cheap cigars. He was 3 days early for rent, which usually meant he had lost big at the dog track and was looking to squeeze his tenants. Nora sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. She unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door an inch, leaving the brass chain engaged. Rent isn't due until Monday, Mr. Miller, she said through the crack. Miller leaned heavily against the doorframe. His face flushed. Yeah, well, circumstances changed. I need it now. Open the door. I don't have it right now. I get paid for a contract on Sunday. Miller's bloodshot eyes narrowed. He slammed his palm against the wood, making Nora flinch. Don't play games with me, you stuck-up little bitch. I know you've got it. Open the damn door before I take it off the hinges. He shoved his shoulder against the door. The cheap brass chain groaned, the screws ripping slightly from the dry, rotted wood. Terror spiked in Nora's throat. She shoved all her weight against the door, trying to close it. Stop it, I'll call the police. Call them. Miller spat, wedging his heavy boot into the gap. He reached through the opening, his thick, hairy fingers grabbing blindly at her shirt. You owe me, Nora. Nora scrambled backward, but he had a grip on her oversized flannel. She panicked, thrashing her hand blindly, reaching for the table near the door. Her fingers closed around the cold, heavy steel of the lighter she had left there yesterday. She didn't think. She brought the heavy metal down as hard as she could on Miller's knuckles. He yowled in pain, ripping his hand back. Nora slammed the door shut, desperately trying to slide the deadbolt home. But Miller kicked the door with a savage grunt. The wood splintered. The door flew open, knocking Nora to the floor. Her elbow hit the cheap linoleum, with a sickening crack pain shooting up her arm. The lighter spun out of her hand, skittering across the floor and hitting the baseboard with a sharp clink. Miller lumbered into the apartment, nursing his bruised hand, his face twisted in ugly rage. You stupid little... He stopped. He was looking down. The silver lighter rested near the toe of his boot. The stylized crown and thorns were facing up, glinting in the pale street light filtering through the window. Nora watched from the floor, clutching her throbbing elbow, all the color violently drained from Miller's face. He looked from the lighter to Nora, his expression morphing from rage to absolute, unadulterated terror. He physically took a step back, as if the lighter were radioactive. Where... Miller's voice was a breathless squeak. Where did you get that? Nora didn't answer. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. Miller swallowed audibly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. I didn't know. Look, Nora, I didn't know you were... I didn't know! He backed out of the doorway, stumbling over the threshold. Forget the rent. It's on the house. Just don't tell them. Please. He turned and practically ran down the hallway. Nora sat on the freezing floor, her chest heaving. The silence of the apartment felt deafening. She looked at the lighter. It was just an object, a piece of metal, but it functioned as a universal translator for violence. It communicated a threat so absolute that a man who was ready to break down her door had just begged for his life. A shadow moved in the hallway outside her broken door. Nora gasped, scrambling backward until her back hit the wall. A man stepped into the doorway. It wasn't Gideon. It was one of the men from the cafe, the one who had been sitting by the window. He was massive, built like a brick wall, wearing a dark suit that strained across his shoulders. He didn't look at her. He looked at the splintered door frame, then down the hallway where Miller had fled. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black phone, and pressed a single button. "We have a breach," the man said softly into the receiver. "Landlord, building's secure. Handle it." He hung up and finally looked at Nora. "Are you injured, Mum? Handle it." Nora repeated, her voice shaking violently. "What does that mean? What are you going to do to him?" The man's expression remained entirely blank. "Mr. Gideon said you were not to be disturbed. The landlord disturbed you. He will be educated on boundaries." "No." Nora scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her elbow. "No, you can't hurt him. He's just an idiot. He was just drunk. He put his hands on you," the man stated as if discussing the weather. "I hit him!" Nora yelled, pointing at the lighter. "I defended myself. You are not touching him. Do you hear me?" The bodyguard just stared at her. He clearly didn't take orders from broke translators in freezing apartments. "Where is Gideon?" Nora demanded, her anger completely overriding her fear. She snatched the lighter off the floor. "Where is he right now?" The man hesitated, analyzing her. "He's working. Take me to him. My orders are to stay. Take me to him right now." Nora snarled, her voice dropping into a register she didn't know she possessed. "Or I swear to God, I will walk out of this building, go straight to the nearest police precinct, and start giving them very detailed descriptions of the men who have been stalking me for 3 days. The bodyguard's jaw tightened. He weighed the threat. A civilian walking into a precinct was a headache. "Get your coat," he said flatly. The car was a black SUV that smelled of chemical cleaner and expensive leather. Nora sat in the back, her cheap coat pulled tight against her body, clutching the steel lighter so hard her knuckles were white. They drove into the warehouse district near the docks, a desolate stretch of concrete barbed wire and sodium lights that bathed everything in an artificial sickly orange glow. The SUV pulled into a subterranean parking garage beneath a massive, unmarked brick building. The bodyguard escorted her to a freight elevator. They rode in silence up to the top floor. When the metal doors slid open, Nora expected a dingy, smoke-filled room full of thugs. Instead, she stepped into an expanse of modern, brutalist architecture. Concrete floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the black water of the harbor, and minimalist leather furniture. It looked like the headquarters of a high-end tech startup, not a Mafia stronghold. The bodyguard led her down a long corridor and opened a heavy, soundproofed door. Gideon was standing behind a massive glass desk. He had his suit jacket off his sleeves, rolled up to the elbows, exposing thick forearms, corded with muscle and ink. He was looking down at a topographical map spread across the glass, a phone pressed to his ear. 3 other men were in the room, all radiating lethal tension. When Nora walked in, the conversation died instantly. All eyes snapped to her. Gideon didn't flinch. He looked up, his grey eyes locking onto her. He spoke quietly into the phone in a language Nora immediately recognized as Russian. The syntax clipped the vocabulary, harsh and commanding. He hung up. He looked at the bodyguard. "Why is she here, Hayes?" "She insisted, sir. Incident with the landlord." Gideon's expression darkened. The atmospheric pressure in the room plummeted. "I thought I told you to handle the landlord." "I am," Hayes replied. "Stop it," Nora said. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to step forward. She walked right up to the glass desk. She slammed the steel lighter down onto the map. The heavy metal made a sharp crack against the glass. "Call them off," she demanded. Gideon looked at the lighter, then slowly brought his gaze up to her face. He noted her pale skin, the slight tremor in her hands, and the way she was favoring her left elbow. "He hurt you," Gideon said softly. I fell, Nora snapped. He's a drunk, pathetic loser who wanted his rent early. He is not a threat to your empire, Gideon. Call your men off. Gideon didn't break eye contact. He didn't raise his voice. He broke down your door. He put his hands on a woman under my protection. If I let that slide, it communicates weakness. In my business, weakness is an invitation for a massacre. I am not in your business. Nora yelled, the frustration boiling over. I am a translator. I live in a crappy apartment. I eat ramen 6 days a week, and I want to be left alone. You are not protecting me. You are holding me hostage with your reputation. The 3 men in the room shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke to Gideon like that. Gideon stared at her. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Nora refused to look away despite the primal instinct screaming at her to submit. She watched his mind work. She saw the precise, calculated way he processed her words. He wasn't insulted. He was evaluating her argument. Finally, Gideon reached for his phone. He pressed a button. Stand down on Miller, he said into the speaker. Just scare him. Break his television. If he ever looks at her again, take his eyes. Understood. A static-laced confirmation came through the speaker. Gideon hung up. He looked back at Nora. Happy... No! Nora said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You still broke into his life to prove a point. I kept you safe. You made me collateral. She shot back. You forced your language onto me. You made everyone look at me and see you. Gideon rested his hands on the glass desk, leaning closer to her. The scent of ozone and dark cologne washed over her, making her breath catch. They see me because you belong in my world now, Nora. He said, his voice dropping into a dark, intimate register that made the hair on her arms stand up. You can analyze the semantics all you want. You can pretend you hate the violence. But when that door was breaking down, you didn't reach for your phone to call the police. You reached for my lighter. Nora's breath hitched. She stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was right. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The contradiction was sickening. She despised everything he stood for. She hated the blood, the fear, the brutal, unyielding control. But when the monster had come to her door, she hadn't called for help. She had reached for a bigger monster. Gideon reached out. His large, scarred hand hovered over hers where it rested on the glass. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from his skin was palpable. You're shaking, he observed quietly. I'm angry, she lied. You're terrified. He corrected his voice, a low, gravelly purr. But not of me. You're terrified because for the first time in your life you feel entirely safe, and you hate what it costs. He picked up the lighter from the desk and pressed it into her palm, folding her fingers over the cold steel. His touch was rough, calloused and grounding. Welcome to the dark, Nora. Gideon whispered. I'll have Hayes drive you home. The door will be fixed by morning. Nora stood frozen as he pulled away, turned his back on her, and picked up a file, instantly dismissing her. She was a solved equation, a completed translation. She turned and walked out, the heavy lighter burning like a brand against her skin. She had won the argument, but as the elevator doors slid shut, sealing her in the quiet descent, she knew with terrifying certainty that she had just lost the war. Pine and industrial wood glue. That was what power smelled like on a Friday morning. Nora woke up to a heavy, suffocating warmth. She kicked off her frayed blankets, completely disoriented by the sensation of sweating in her own bedroom. She sat up, her bare feet hitting the warped floorboards. The radiator in the corner, a rusted cast-iron relic that had been dead for 6 months, was violently hissing, pumping dry, aggressive heat into the tiny space. She walked into her narrow hallway. Her front door wasn't just fixed, it was entirely replaced. The splintered, cheap veneer was gone. In its place stood a solid, heavy-core steel door, painted a matte, unassuming brown to match the dilapidated aesthetic of the corridor. But the hardware was different. Instead of a flimsy chain and a sticking keyhole, There was a heavy commercial deadbolt and a keypad. A small, pristine white envelope rested on the kitchen counter. Nora stared at it for a long time before she picked it up. Her fingers felt thick and clumsy. Inside was a heavy brass key and a small card with a 4-digit code. No note, no signature. Gideon didn't need to sign his work. His arrogance was his watermark. Over the next 2 weeks, Nora learned that captivity didn't always look like iron bars. Sometimes it looked like extreme, terrifying convenience. She tried to return to her routine. She took her laptop to grind and pour. The cafe was open to the public again, but the atmosphere was permanently altered. The teenage barista Chloe had been replaced by the quiet, dangerously polite European man. Nora's corner table was always empty, always clean with a fresh, scalding Americano, waiting the second she walked through the door. When she tried to pay, the barista simply tapped the counter and shook his head. She went to the corner bodega to buy her usual pathetic groceries, instant ramen, bruised apples, cheap bread. When she placed her items on the counter, the owner, an older man who usually yelled at her for counting out quarters, just bagged her food with trembling hands and refused to look her in the eye. "Taken care of, miss," he mumbled, staring fixedly at the cash register. Nora felt sick. She left the groceries on the counter and walked out into the biting wind. She was a ghost in her own neighborhood. Gideon had wrapped her in an invisible, suffocating layer of protection that fundamentally severed her from the world. No one bumped into her on the sidewalk. The guys who usually catcalled from the auto repair shop went dead silent when she walked past, their eyes dropping to the pavement. Hayes, the massive bodyguard, was never far. He didn't hover, but she saw him. A shadow in the reflection of a shop window. The dark SUV idling 3 blocks down. She was safe, and she had never felt more entirely out of control. By the 3rd Tuesday, the isolation cracked her. She was sitting in her apartment, staring at a translation job on her screen, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. The silence of the heavily insulated steel door was maddening. A sharp, firm knock shattered the quiet. Nora jumped. She walked to the door, peering through the newly installed reinforced peephole. It was Hayes. She unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open. "I don't need anything, Hayes. The heat is fine. The lock works." He didn't acknowledge her sarcasm. He held out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. "Mr. Gideon requires your professional services. Standard contractor rates will be applied to your account." Nora stared at the envelope. "My services, I translate corporate training manuals and technical specs. He is aware of your qualifications. The vehicle is downstairs. I'm not going anywhere with you." Hayes simply stood there, an immovable mountain of dark wool and indifference. "The document is time-sensitive. He requested your specific analytical methodology. You have 5 minutes to gather your equipment." Nora's pride screamed at her to slam the door in his face, but a darker, sharper curiosity twisted in her gut. Gideon didn't ask for favors. If he was pulling her into his orbit, it wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a tactical maneuver. She grabbed her laptop bag. She didn't put on makeup. She wore her faded jeans and a heavy gray sweater, a deliberate refusal to play dress-up for his world. Before she walked out, her eyes caught the heavy steel lighter sitting on her dresser. She snatched it up and shoved it deep into her coat pocket. The metal felt cold against her knuckles. They didn't go to the brutalist warehouse by the docks. Hayes drove her to the financial district, pulling into the underground garage of a sleek, glass-paneled skyscraper that housed high-end hedge funds and corporate law firms. "Up!" Hayes commanded, swiping a keycard in the private elevator. They rode in silence to the 42nd floor. The doors slid open to reveal a massive, minimalist conference room bathed in the grey light of the overcast city. Gideon sat at the head of a sprawling mahogany table. He looked immaculate and exhausted. A charcoal 3-piece suit gripped his broad shoulders, his tie loosened a fraction of an inch. Across from him sat 3 men Nora didn't recognize. They wore expensive suits, but they didn't wear them like businessmen. They wore them like armor, The man in the center, an older gentleman with a thick, neatly trimmed silver beard and cold reptilian eyes, stopped speaking the moment Nora entered. Gideon didn't stand, but his gaze snapped to her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You're late," Gideon said softly. Nora ignored the jab. She walked to the empty chair to Gideon's right. Hayes pulled it out for her. She sat down, acutely aware of the three strangers dissecting her appearance. She felt incredibly small in her oversized sweater, but she forced her spine entirely straight. "Miss Nora." Gideon said, his voice a smooth, dangerous drawl that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. "This is Mr. Declan Ross. He represents a logistics collective operating out of the Boston ports. Irish mob." Nora translated internally, keeping her face completely blank. "We are finalizing a mutually beneficial transit agreement." Gideon continued, tapping a thick stack of papers resting between them. "Mr. Ross insists on using his own legal counsel's drafting. The terminology is dense. I want you to read Article 4, subsection B. Tell me exactly what it means. Not what it says. What it means." Ross leaned forward, a patronizing smile twisting his lips. "With all due respect, Gideon, we don't need a civilian girl holding up a multi-million-dollar handshake because she has to look up legal jargon." Gideon didn't look at Ross. He kept his eyes on Nora. "Read it." Nora pulled the document toward her. The paper was thick, high-stock cotton. She scanned the dense block of text. Her brain automatically switched gears, dropping the fear and engaging the analytical engine she used to survive. She read the paragraph twice, her brow furrowed. She read the surrounding clauses. The silence in the room was suffocating. She could hear the faint, high-pitched hum of the overhead lights, the slow tick of a heavy gold watch on Ross's wrist, and the deep, measured rhythm of Gideon's breathing beside her. She pushed the paper back. "Well, sweetheart," Ross mocked gently. "Did you find a typo?" Nora ignored him. She looked directly at Gideon. "It's a liability trap," she said, her voice steady and clear in the quiet room. "The syntax in subsection B shifts from passive to active voice halfway through. It states that your organization assumes responsibility for cargo securing, but in the event of federal interdiction, the indemnity clause only covers domestic transit anomalies." Gideon's eyes narrowed slightly. Meaning. Nora said, tapping the paper with her index finger, "The moment that cargo crosses into international waters or gets flagged by the Coast Guard instead of local port authority, this contract legally designates you as the sole owner of the contraband. They aren't sharing the risk, Gideon. They are building a legal firewall. If the shipment gets raided, you take the federal trafficking charge, and they walk away clean with the advance payment." The patronizing smile vanished from Declan Ross's face. The two men flanking him shifted violently in their seats, their hands dropping below the edge of the mahogany table. Instantly, Hayes stepped out of the shadows by the door. Gideon didn't move a muscle. He slowly turned his head to look at Ross. The brutal, dead-eyed apex predator Nora had seen in the cafe returned in full force. "A typo, Declan," Gideon whispered. The softness of his voice was vastly more terrifying than a shout. "The girl doesn't know what she's talking about." Ross growled, his Irish brogue thickening with sudden adrenaline. "It's standard maritime liability phrasing. She translates the exact meaning of words for a living." Gideon replied, leaning back in his chair. "And you just tried to use semantics to put a federal noose around my neck." Nora's heart began to hammer against her ribs. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the metallic scent of impending violence. She had just exposed a betrayal. She had just pulled the pin on a grenade. "We negotiated in good faith," Ross spat, standing up. "If you're going to let a piece of skirt blow up this deal, sit down," Gideon commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a physical force. Ross hesitated, looking at Hayes, then at Gideon. Slowly he lowered himself back into the leather chair. Gideon reached into his jacket pocket. Nora flinched, expecting a gun. Instead, he pulled out a sleek silver pen. He uncapped it, dragged the contract toward him, and drew a thick, aggressive line through the entire 4th article. "You rewrite this section," Gideon said, sliding the paper back across the table. "You assume equal federal liability, and you drop your transit fee by 20% to compensate me for the insult to my intelligence." 20% is robbery, Ross snarled. "It's the price of a poor vocabulary," Gideon countered smoothly. "Take it, or the only thing moving through my docks next week will be the bodies of your lieutenants." Ross stared at Gideon with pure, unadulterated hatred. He snatched the paper off the table. "You're making a mistake, Gideon. You don't have the muscle to fight us on the East Coast." "I have enough," Gideon said, standing up. The meeting was over. "Get out of my building." Ross and his men stood. They didn't shake hands. As they walked past, Nora Ross paused, glaring down at her. "Smart girl." Ross muttered, his eyes raking over her with cold malice. "Hope you're smart enough to know what happens to people who read things they shouldn't." He didn't get to finish the threat. In a blur of motion that Nora barely registered, Gideon closed the distance. He grabbed Ross by the back of the neck, his large hand wrapping entirely around the older man's throat, and slammed his face down into the mahogany table with a sickening crack. Nora screamed, scrambling backward in her chair. The 2 Irish bodyguards reached into their coats, but Hayes already had a suppressed pistol drawn aimed dead at the chest of the man on the left. The room froze on a razor's edge. Ross groaned, blood pouring from his shattered nose, pooling on the polished wood. Gideon held him pinned, his knee pressed into the small of Ross's back, twisting his arm at a grotesque angle. Gideon didn't look at the bodyguards. He looked at the side of Ross's bleeding face. "You do not speak to her!" Gideon whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, terrifying, completely unhinged rage. "You do not look at her. You do not acknowledge she exists. If you ever threaten her again, Declan, I will peel the skin from your face and make your children watch. Nod if you understand." Ross let out a strangled, pathetic gurgle, nodding his head frantically against the wood. Gideon released him, stepping back and straightening his cuffs. Ross collapsed onto the floor, clutching his face, blood ruining his expensive suit. His men scrambled to haul him up, their eyes wide with shock. "Get him out of here," Gideon commanded. Hayes escorted the bleeding, stumbling men out of the conference room. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them. The silence rushed back in, but it was ruined. The room smelled of copper, expensive scotch, and raw fear. Nora sat frozen in her chair. Her lungs refused to take in air. Her hands gripped the armrests so hard her joints ached. She was shaking violently, her teeth chattering in her skull. She had watched movies. She had translated descriptions of violence. But the visceral reality of it, the wet crunch of cartilage, the sudden explosive speed of a man intent on causing harm, was entirely different. Gideon turned to her. The brutal rage evaporated from his face, replaced by a sudden sharp concern. He crossed the room and crouched down beside her chair, putting himself below her eye level. He reached out his large, blood-flecked hand, hovering over her trembling knees. "Nora, breathe. You—" Nora gasped, her voice sounding thin and ragged. "You broke his face. He threatened you. He just talked!" She yelled, the panic finally breaking through. She pushed herself out of the chair, backing away from him, until her spine hit the glass wall overlooking the city. "He just said words. You didn't have to do that." Gideon stood up slowly. "Words are bullets in my world, Nora. You know that. You just proved it. If I didn't react, he would have thought you were unprotected. He would have sent someone to your apartment tonight to slit your throat just to prove a point to me. Then let me go." Nora screamed, tears of sheer, overwhelming frustration spilling down her cheeks. "Stop protecting me. I was fine before you sat at my table. I was poor and I was cold, but I didn't have blood on my shoes." She pointed a trembling finger at the red smear on the mahogany table. Gideon took a step toward her. Nora flinched, turning her head away. The gesture hit him harder than a physical blow. He stopped. For the first time since she met him, the Mafia boss looked uncertain. The absolute authority fractured, revealing a profound, terrifying isolation underneath. "I can't let you go!" Gideon said, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "Why?" she sobbed. "Because you didn't look away," he answered. He closed the distance between them, ignoring her flinch. He placed his hands flat against the cold glass on either side of her head, trapping her, but refusing to touch her. "When I walked into that cafe bleeding, everyone else pretended I didn't exist. You saw the monster and you didn't look away. You told me I was bleeding on your table." Nora looked up at him. His grey eyes were entirely stripped of their armor. They were desperate. "You understand the semantics, Nora," Gideon murmured, leaning in until his breath ghosted across her cheek. The smell of his cologne mixed with the copper tang of blood in the air. "You know exactly what I am. You know I'm a violent, ruthless bastard. But you also know that when that landlord broke your door down, the first thing you reached for was me. It was self-defense," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was a choice," he corrected softly. "You chose the predator to kill the wolf, and you hate yourself for it." He finally lowered his hands, his fingers lightly brushing the sides of her neck. His touch was burning hot. Nora's breath hitched. She should pull away. She should run to the elevator. But the toxic magnetic pull of the gravity he generated rooted her to the spot. "I won't apologize for what I am," Gideon said, his thumb tracing her jawline. "I won't pretend I can be a good man for you, but I can promise you this: in a world that constantly tries to crush you, I will burn down entire cities to keep you breathing." Nora stared at the blood on his knuckles. She looked at the brutal, beautiful architecture of his face. She felt the heavy steel lighter burning a hole in her coat pocket. She was an English major. She understood the power of a definitive statement. She understood that accepting his touch wasn't just a romance. It was a pact. It was complicity. Slowly, deliberately, Nora reached into her pocket. Her fingers closed around the cold metal of the lighter. She pulled it out and held it between them. "If I stay," Nora said, her voice dropping into a register as cold and unyielding as his, "you don't hide the violence from me. You don't treat me like a civilian you have to shelter. If I'm in the dark with you, Gideon, I want to see exactly where we're walking." A slow, dark smile spread across Gideon's face, predatory and deeply relieved. He reached down, wrapping his large hand completely over hers, encasing her fist and the steel lighter in his grip. "Every step," he promised. He leaned down and pressed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was aggressive, possessive, and tasted heavily of adrenaline and ruin. Nora didn't melt. She kissed him back with a fierce, desperate anger, pulling him down by the lapels of his ruined suit, fully aware that she was stepping off the edge of a cliff. She had traded her cold, pathetic safety for a warm, luxurious cage, and heaven help her, she was going to swallow the key. Did the darkness pull you in? Nora made a terrifying choice, trading a quiet, struggling life for the lethal protection of a man who speaks entirely in violence. If you loved the tension, the sensory details, and the raw contradiction of their romance, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who craves a Mafia story where the heroine doesn't just survive the monster, she demands a seat at his table. Subscribe so you never miss a chapter of their descent. And drop a comment below. Would you have kept the lighter?